At what point, Mike, and for what reason or reasons did alarm bells start to ring for you?
Yeah. Early on in 2020, I was in Nice with my wife when we heard tell of this virus coming, and I was really quite frightened. The annual Nice Carnival closed a day early. It's only about 30 miles, I think, from the northern Italian border, and we were very conscious that the virus could be in the crowd. I looked at the statistics, and it looked like at that age, 60, I might have a 1% chance of dying. I didn't fancy that, so I was quite worried. We went home, and as we came up towards the first lockdown, my concern moved to consternation, because I heard government advisors saying things that I just didn't understand why they were saying them, because I knew they weren't true. I could give a couple of examples about saying, well, we're not sure if you've survived this virus whether you'll be immune. And I thought, well, Immunology 101 will tell you that you should expect to be immune for a substantial period of time, possibly for life. And so at that point, I started listening and thinking, why are you saying these things? I also went to check what data there was in the public domain, like the Diamond Princess. There was an outbreak, big outbreak on a cruise ship, mostly occupied by people of my age and older, which are the prime group to get ill and die. And yet it looked like the lethality was at least 10 times less than they were telling us from Wuhan. And so I thought, by the end of it, I thought, the actual threat in the environment is not much worse than a severe influenza. It's not influenza, different virus, but that's the measure of the threat. And yet suddenly we started doing astonishing things like lockdowns. Seriously, it's so that's what, around March. And my wife reminds me that after the first 3 weeks to flatten the curve, when it was extended, she reminds me often that I was tearing up and down the stairs saying, we are in so much trouble. I knew at that point. So seriously, I knew at that point something very bad was happening. And I'm afraid the impression that something bad has happened, as a professional scientist, it's been absolutely obvious to me by May 2020 that I'm afraid it's nothing like you've been told. And a couple of colleagues of mine, doctors Claire Craig and Jonathan Engler, did an exhaustive review of the evidence for asymptomatic transmission. That's a small publication you can go and find. I think it was 7 case reports, 5 or 6 were from China. So I'm afraid we're not able to necessarily check that data. And there was one famous case in Europe of an executive that came back from China and visited several plants in Germany, infecting, I think, 16 of her colleagues. And the claim was that she was asymptomatically transmitting it. But actually, some German journalists followed up within the first 2 days and found out that she had flu, and she'd been taking over-the-counter remedies to kind of barrel through her day. That is the totality of evidence supporting asymptomatic transmission, and decades of evidence, including statements by Fauci and the WHO, go in the opposite direction, including, as I mentioned, papers, peer-reviewed journal articles that have studied this do not find it. So I put it to your listeners that that's a central plank. That's a central plank of policy.
Mike, if you bear with me, one of my guests here tonight, Scarlett Maguire, a former Labour advisor, is making it plain to me that she has something she'd like to ask you.
My problem is that I caught COVID from asymptomatic. I mean, there were 19 of us at my mother's funeral. None of us had any symptoms. Within 2 days, 15 of us had come down with it. Some quite seriously, one in hospital. And I mean, obviously, somebody at that funeral had the beginnings of it, but there were no obvious symptoms. I mean, you hear that again and again. I don't understand how you can say that it's just not true.
You don't. That's anecdote. I'm not going to argue with your anecdote.
To me.
I won't do that. Scientists don't argue with that. Anecdotes are not data. So I'm not going to agree or disagree with you. What I'm saying is, when you study it systematically and study hundreds of people who have PCR positive tests but no symptoms, and PCR positive tests with symptoms, and explore over weeks and months how many infect other people, you find that it's 17% if you're symptomatic and approximates the false positive rate for the test if you're asymptomatic. And there are dozens of papers like that. So I'm not saying it never occurs. It's very important, in fact, that you understand I'm not saying it never occurs. What I am saying is it's epidemiologically irrelevant. It does not drive epidemics